Welcome back to Wartime Whispers. In this video, we're diving into one of history's most chilling final chapters, the last days of Adolf Hitler in his Berlin bunker. As the Third Reich crumbled around him and Soviet forces closed in, the man who once commanded millions faced the ultimate collapse of his empire and his own delusions. So get comfortable, and let's explore the moment when Hitler's world and his grip on reality finally fell apart. It's late April 1945, and beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, in a concrete tomb 20 feet underground, Adolf Hitler sits alone in the dim light, staring at a portrait of Frederick the Great. Above him, the city that once hosted his greatest triumphs is being systematically destroyed. The sound of Soviet artillery grows closer with each passing hour, a relentless drumbeat of Germany's impending doom. The man who once commanded the most powerful military machine in history, who had sent millions to their deaths with a signature, who had stood before crowds of hundreds of thousands and made them believe in his vision of a new world order, now controls nothing but a handful of terrified secretaries, aging generals living in denial, and a few square meters of damp, cold concrete. For years he had convinced himself that destiny was on his side, that fate itself had chosen him specifically to reshape the world, to create an empire that would last 1,000 years. He had told himself, and made millions believe, that he was infallible, that his will alone could bend reality to his purposes. Now, in this final chapter, as the walls literally close in around him, that illusion is about to shatter completely. And the question that haunts these last days, the question that makes this story so compelling and so terrifying, isn't just how the Third Reich fell or why Germany lost the war. It's the moment, the precise moment, when Hitler himself finally understood, deep in whatever remained of his soul, that everything he had built was collapsing into rubble and ash, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. The bunker complex beneath the Reich Chancellery wasn't built for comfort or for life. It was a utilitarian concrete maze, a military necessity that had become a prison. There were two levels, the upper Vorbunker and the lower Führerbunker, connected by a spiral staircase that wound down into the earth like a descent into hell itself. The corridors were narrow, claustrophobic, barely wide enough for two people to pass without turning sideways. The ceilings were low, oppressively so, making even average height men feel like they had to hunch over. And the smell, God, the smell was something that everyone who survived those final days remembered with visceral disgust. It was diesel fuel from the generators that ran constantly, trying to keep the lights on and the ventilation systems working. It was the sweat of too many unwashed bodies crammed into too small a space, because there was no water pressure for showers, barely enough for drinking. It was cigarette smoke that hung in the stale air because the ventilation couldn't keep up. It was the smell of fear itself, that sharp, acrid scent that comes from people who know they're trapped, who know that death is coming and there's no escape. And underneath it all was something else, something harder to name but impossible to ignore. The smell of rot, of an empire dying from within, of a regime that had built itself on lies and violence finally consuming itself. The upper bunker, the Vorbunker, housed the staff, the guards, the servants, who kept the whole operation functioning. Down below, in the Führerbunker proper, was Hitler's domain. 18 rooms in total, though calling them rooms was generous. They were concrete boxes, cramped and cold despite the generators. There was a conference room where Hitler still held his daily military briefings, standing over maps spread across a large table, moving colored pins that represented divisions and armies that in many cases no longer existed except on paper. His private quarters consisted of a small bedroom, barely larger than a prison cell, with a single bed, a nightstand, and that portrait of Frederick the Great on the wall. Eva Braun had her own room nearby, slightly more comfortable, where she tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy by playing music on a gramophone and entertaining the secretaries with champagne when they could find it. There was a small switchboard room where the last tenuous communications with the outside world flickered in and out, operators desperately trying to maintain contact with military units that were being overrun or had already ceased to exist. There were storage rooms filled with canned food, water containers, and crates of documents that would never be filed. And everywhere, penetrating everything, was the constant hum of the ventilation systems, struggling to push fresh air through the concrete walls that seemed to grow thicker, heavier, more suffocating with each passing day. By mid-April 1945, the situation above ground had transcended mere military defeat and become something apocalyptic. Berlin was no longer a functioning city in any meaningful sense. It was a battlefield, a killing ground, a vision of hell brought to earth. The Red Army had completed its encirclement of the city, a massive steel noose of tanks, artillery, and millions of soldiers, tightening methodically, crushing everything in its path. And now they were pressing inward from all directions simultaneously, grinding through the desperate feudal German defenses, street by street, block by block, building by building, room by room. Soviet artillery batteries, hundreds of them positioned in a ring around the city, fired thousands upon thousands of shells every single hour. A mechanical storm of high explosives that turned entire neighborhoods into landscapes of rubble and dust. The sky above Berlin was permanently dark, not with natural clouds, but with thick black smoke from thousands of fires burning out of control across the city. Entire apartment blocks were engulfed in flames, the fires spreading from building to building because there was no one left to fight them, no water pressure in the mains to feed the hoses, even if there had been firefighters. The smell of burning wood, burning flesh, and burning dreams hung over everything like a funeral shroud. Civilians who hadn't managed to flee before the encirclement, and there were still hundreds of thousands of them trapped in this nightmare, were hiding wherever they could find shelter. They crammed into cellars that became tombs when the buildings above collapsed. They huddled in subway tunnels, living in the dark, among the rats and the sewage, praying that the next shell wouldn't score a direct hit and flood the tunnels with fire or debris. They emerged only when absolutely necessary, to search for food or water, scavenging through ruins, eating whatever they could find, drinking from contaminated sources because the alternative was death by dehydration. And they lived in constant terror, not just of the Soviet shells and bombs, but of what would happen when the Red Army finally reached them. Stories of what Soviet soldiers did to German civilians, especially women, had spread through the city like wildfire. Some of these stories were exaggerated propaganda designed to make Germans fight harder. Many were not. The Red Army was coming for revenge, and everyone knew it. German soldiers were still fighting, but it was no longer a real military defense. It was suicide by combat. Many of these defenders were just boys, members of the Hitler Youth, who had been handed rifles and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and told to hold back the Soviet tide. They were 14, 15, 16 years old, children playing at war, because all the real soldiers were already dead or captured or had fled. They didn't know how to fight properly. They barely knew how to use their weapons. They were terrified, confused, and they died in droves, cut down by Soviet machine guns and tanks before they could even fire a shot. Mixed in with these children were the remnants of actual military units, exhausted veterans who had survived the Eastern Front only to be pulled back for this final pointless battle. And then there were the fanatics, the true believers, the SS officers, and hardcore Nazis who still thought they could win, or who preferred death to surrender. These men prowled the streets of Berlin like executioners, hanging anyone they suspected of defeatism or desertion. Lampposts became gallows. Bodies dangled from street signs with cardboard signs around their necks declaring them traitors and cowards. The message was clear. You would fight until you died, or the SS would kill you themselves. The city that had once celebrated Hitler's rise to power with torchlight parades and enthusiastic crowds was now paying the ultimate price for his ambitions, drowning in its own blood. But down in the bunker, insulated from reality by 20 feet of concrete and steel, Hitler's daily routine continued with an eerie, almost surreal sense of normalcy, at least in those first days of April, before everything finally fell apart. He woke late, usually around 11 in the morning, sometimes even later. His health had deteriorated so dramatically over the previous year that he barely resembled the vigorous leader who had strutted across stages a decade earlier. His left hand trembled constantly, uncontrollably, a symptom of what most doctors who examined the evidence posthumously agreed was Parkinson's disease, though it was never officially diagnosed. He had to hold his right hand over his left to hide the shaking during meetings, a vanity that fooled no one, but which he maintained nonetheless. He shuffled when he walked, his back permanently hunched, moving like a man 30 years older than his 56 years. His face, once animated with rage or passion or charisma, depending on what the situation required, had become a pale, waxy mask, the skin an unhealthy grayish color, the features slack and lifeless, except when anger temporarily revived them. His eyes, those cold blue eyes that had once held audiences of millions transfixed, now seemed distant and unfocused, as if he was seeing something far beyond the concrete walls around him, or perhaps seeing nothing at all. He ate little, picking at mostly vegetarian meals prepared by his personal cook, a woman named Constanze Manziarli, who struggled daily to find fresh ingredients in a city under siege where food supplies had collapsed. Hitler had been a vegetarian for years, partly for health reasons, partly because he claimed it made him feel more pure, more in control. Now he barely touched even the simple dishes she prepared. He drank weak tea, cup after cup of it, as if the caffeine might somehow restore the energy that had drained from his body. And he took an absolutely astonishing array of pills and injections, administered multiple times a day by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, a man whose medical practices were questionable at best and potentially criminal at worst. Vitamins, hormones, testosterone, opiates, amphetamines, strange experimental compounds that Morell claimed would restore Hitler's vigor and clarity. It was a chemical cocktail that would have killed most people outright, and instead of healing Hitler, it seemed to be slowly poisoning him, making him more erratic, more paranoid, more divorced from reality with each passing day. The military briefings were the absolute center of Hitler's day, the one ritual that gave him any remaining sense of purpose and control. Twice a day, sometimes more often if the situation warranted it, his generals would gather in the small conference room. They would spread enormous maps across the table, maps of Berlin, maps of Germany, maps of the entire European theater of war, though most of Europe was no longer relevant because it was already lost. They would move colored pins and markers representing divisions, corps, and armies, and Hitler would lean over these maps for hours at a time, his trembling hand hovering over the paper, his finger tracing lines of advance and retreat, planning elaborate counterattacks, issuing detailed orders to units that in many cases no longer existed or were so depleted that they were divisions, in name only, battalions, or even companies in reality. His generals knew the truth. Every single one of them knew that Germany had lost the war, that there was no possibility of victory, that the only question remaining was how long until the final surrender and how many more people would die in the meantime. But saying this out loud was literally unthinkable. Officers who had suggested retreat or compromise in earlier stages of the war had been relieved of command, arrested, or even executed. The culture of the Third Reich, especially in its final stages, was one of absolute obedience and absolute denial of reality. So the generals nodded. They took notes in their leather-bound books. They clicked their heels and saluted and pretended that the armies on the map were real and capable of carrying out the orders being given. And Hitler, despite everything, despite all the evidence of his own eyes and ears, seemed to genuinely believe it. Or perhaps he simply refused to accept any alternative. Reality had become negotiable in his mind, something that could be bent and shaped by sheer force of will, as if believing hard enough in victory could somehow make it manifest. But even will has its limits. Even delusion cannot stand forever against the weight of physical reality. And in mid-April 1945, those limits were reached, and that delusion began to crack. The breaking point, the moment when everything began to unravel psychologically for Hitler, came with General Felix Steiner and the counterattack that never happened. Hitler had ordered Steiner, a respected SS general who commanded what was designated as Army Detachment Steiner, to launch a massive counterattack from the north of Berlin. The plan, at least as Hitler conceived it in his mind, was brilliant, elegant, and decisive. Steiner would drive south with overwhelming force, smashing into the Soviet armies besieging Berlin from the north, cutting through their lines, relieving the city, and turning the entire battle around. On paper, looking at the map in the dim light of the bunker conference room, it made perfect sense. The arrows were clear, the objective was defined, and Hitler had assigned 3 full divisions to carry out the attack, which should have been more than sufficient. In reality, however, it was not just impossible, but insane, so divorced from the actual situation on the ground that it qualified as a psychotic break from reality. Steiner's forces were not 3 powerful, well-equipped divisions ready for offensive operations. They were a ragtag, thrown-together collection of exhausted soldiers pulled from units that had already been shattered in previous fighting, undertrained recruits who had been given uniforms and rifles just days earlier, Luftwaffe ground personnel who were pilots and mechanics, suddenly expected to fight as infantry despite having no training for it, and depleted units scraped together from various commands across the collapsing front. Steiner barely had the equivalent of 1 division, and even that was generous. He lacked ammunition. He lacked fuel for his vehicles. He lacked artillery support. He lacked air cover because the Luftwaffe had been obliterated and barely existed anymore. And most critically, most fatally for Hitler's plan, he lacked enough men to carry out an offensive against the massive Soviet forces that outnumbered him 10-1 or more. The order Hitler had given was not just difficult, it was impossible. It could not be done. Every general in the bunker knew it could not be done. Steiner himself knew it could not be done, but no one dared tell Hitler the truth to his face. So they passed the order along, and Steiner, a professional soldier who understood military reality, looked at his forces, looked at the situation, and made the only rational decision possible. He did not attack. He could not attack. Attempting to carry out Hitler's order would have meant the complete destruction of his forces within hours for no purpose whatsoever. So when the daily military briefing came on April 22, 1945, and Hitler asked for an update on Steiner's attack, expecting to hear news of a great victory, of Soviet lines broken and Berlin saved, there was instead a long, terrible, suffocating silence in that conference room. The generals looked at each other. No one wanted to be the one to speak. No one wanted to be the bearer of this particular news. Finally, someone, accounts differ on exactly who had the courage or the misfortune to do it, spoke up. Steiner had not attacked. Steiner did not have the forces necessary to carry out the order. Steiner could not comply with the directive he had been given. For a moment, for what must have felt like an eternity to everyone in that room, Hitler didn't react at all. He just stared down at the map, his trembling hand resting on the table, his eyes fixed on the little pins and markers that represented Steiner's attack that had never happened. Then something inside him, some final psychological barrier that had been holding back the truth, completely broke. And what happened next was described by every witness who survived as the single most terrifying moment they had ever experienced in their lives. Hitler began to scream, not the calculated theatrical rage he often used to intimidate his subordinates and get his way. The kind of performance anger that he could turn on and off like a switch. This was something else entirely. This was raw, primal, uncontrolled fury mixed with terror and despair. He accused his generals of betrayal, of deliberately sabotaging his plans, of cowardice and weakness and treachery. He slammed his fists down on the table with such force that papers and maps flew across the room and scattered on the floor. He tore at his own hair. His face turned red, then purple, the veins standing out on his forehead and neck. Spittle flew from his mouth as he screamed incomprehensible accusations and threats. His body shook, not just his hand, but his entire frame, convulsing with rage. And then, in the middle of this absolutely terrifying tirade, he said something that no one in that room had ever heard him say before. Something that was unthinkable, something that shattered the entire foundation of the Nazi regime in a single sentence. The war is lost. The room went absolutely silent. The screaming stopped. Even the sound of artillery above, which had been a constant background presence, seemed to fade away. His generals stood frozen, literally frozen in place, unsure if they had heard correctly, unsure if they were even allowed to acknowledge what had just been said. Hitler collapsed back into his chair, suddenly drained, deflated, as if those 4 words had taken every last bit of energy he had left in his broken body. He waved them away with a weak, dismissive gesture. "Everyone out. Get out. Leave me." They filed out quickly, silently, grateful for any excuse to escape that room and that moment. In the hallway outside, they exchanged glances but said nothing. What was there to say? What words could possibly encompass what had just happened? The man who had led Germany for 12 years, who had promised them glory and conquest, an empire, and a 1,000-year Reich, who had told them they were the master race destined to rule the world, had just admitted that it was all over, that everything they had fought for and sacrificed for and killed for was lost. But here's what makes this moment so psychologically fascinating and so deeply disturbing. After that complete breakdown, after finally speaking the truth out loud, after admitting that the war was lost and that everything was collapsing, Hitler didn't surrender. He didn't start negotiating for better terms. He didn't flee to try to save his own life. He didn't even change his fundamental strategy or acknowledge that his approach had been wrong. Instead, he retreated deeper into fantasy, into delusion, into a version of reality that existed only in his own mind. When his staff returned to the conference room later that day, they found him calmer, eerily calm, as if the breakdown had never happened. But he had made decisions. He would stay in Berlin. He would not leave the city, no matter what happened. He would not flee to the Bavarian Alps, where the remnants of German forces could potentially make a last stand. He would remain in this bunker, and he would die in this bunker. And before he died, he would make absolutely certain that everyone he believed had betrayed him would pay for their treachery. The breakdown wasn't an acceptance of reality. It was the moment Hitler decided that if he couldn't win, if he couldn't have his empire and his glory, then he would drag everyone down with him into destruction. The first target of his paranoid rage was Hermann Göring. Göring, once Hitler's closest confidant and designated successor, the flamboyant Reichsmarshal who had commanded the Luftwaffe in the early years of the war when it had seemed invincible, had fled Berlin weeks earlier. He was in Bavaria, in Berchtesgaden, far from the fighting and the destruction, enjoying what was left of his massive looted art collection and feeding his substantial morphine addiction. On April 23rd, the day after Hitler's breakdown, Göring sent a telegram to the bunker. It was carefully worded, almost deferential in its language, clearly written by someone trying to avoid giving offense, but the meaning was absolutely clear to anyone reading it. Göring pointed out that Hitler was now cut off in Berlin, surrounded by Soviet forces, unable to govern Germany effectively from the bunker. He suggested respectfully that under these circumstances, and in accordance with the decree Hitler himself had issued years earlier naming Göring as his successor, perhaps it would be appropriate for Göring to assume leadership of the Reich and begin negotiations with the Western Allies to end the war. To anyone thinking rationally, to anyone looking at the situation with clear eyes, this was not just a reasonable proposal, but an obviously necessary one. Hitler was trapped. The war was lost. He had admitted as much. Himself. Someone needed to take charge and try to salvage something from the wreckage, to end the fighting, and save whatever German lives could still be saved. But Hitler's mind no longer worked rationally. He no longer looked at situations with clear eyes. He saw the telegram not as a practical suggestion from a loyal subordinate trying to help, but as betrayal of the most fundamental kind, as a coup attempt, as proof that Göring had been waiting for this moment all along, plotting to seize power the instant Hitler appeared weak. He exploded in rage again, screaming about traitors and conspirators. He ordered Göring's immediate arrest, his expulsion from all party positions, his removal from the line of succession. Göring, the man who had stood beside him since the earliest days of the Nazi Party, who had helped him seize power in 1933, who had built the Luftwaffe into a weapon of terror, was declared a traitor, and Hitler made absolutely certain that everyone in the bunker knew about it, that everyone understood the penalty for even appearing to question his authority or suggest alternatives to his rule. Then came Heinrich Himmler, and this betrayal cut even deeper because it shattered one of Hitler's last remaining illusions. Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, the head of the SS, the man who commanded the entire apparatus of Nazi terror, had never shown even a hint of disloyalty. He was the ultimate true believer, the fanatic's fanatic, or so everyone thought. But Himmler, like Göring, could see that the war was lost, and Germany was being destroyed. And unlike Göring, he had done more than just send a telegram. Through an intermediary, a Swedish diplomat named Count Folke Bernadotte, Himmler had opened secret negotiations with the Western Allies. He had proposed a separate peace, offering to surrender to the British and Americans, while continuing to fight the Soviets, hoping that the Western powers would accept Germany as an ally against communism. It was delusional in its own way. The Allies had already agreed on unconditional surrender and would never cut a deal with someone like Himmler, but at least it was an attempt to end the war and save some German lives. When word of Himmler's negotiations reached Hitler on April 28th, through intelligence reports and radio intercepts, the reaction was worse than with Göring. This wasn't just rage. This was something colder, something more terrifying, a quiet, seething, murderous fury. Himmler's betrayal destroyed Hitler's last psychological anchor, the belief that the SS, his elite guard, his Praetorian force, his true believers, would never abandon him. If even Himmler, loyal Himmler, faithful Himmler, had lost faith and was trying to make peace behind his back, then who could be trusted? The answer, Hitler concluded, was no one. Everyone had betrayed him. Everyone was weak and cowardly and unworthy. He ordered Himmler to be arrested and executed, though the order was meaningless because Himmler was far beyond Hitler's reach now, out in the collapsing Reich, somewhere beyond the Soviet lines. But Himmler's representative in the bunker, SS General Hermann Fegelein, who happened to be Eva Braun's brother-in-law, was not beyond reach. Hitler had him dragged out of his quarters, taken up to the garden, and shot without ceremony or trial. The message was absolutely clear and utterly chilling. There would be no mercy. There would be no forgiveness. Loyalty was measured only by willingness to die alongside him in this bunker, and any hint of wanting to survive, of wanting to find another way, was treason punishable by death. As these personal betrayals mounted, as Hitler's inner circle collapsed and scattered, the physical world around the bunker continued its own collapse. The Red Army was no longer measured in miles away or kilometers away. They were blocks away, then streets away, then buildings away. You could hear individual sounds now, not just the general thunder of artillery, but specific, distinct noises. The grinding, mechanical sound of tank treads on broken pavement, the sharp crack of rifle fire, the chatter of machine guns, the screams of wounded soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire. Soviet infantry had reached the Tiergarten, Berlin's massive central park that had once been a beautiful green space and was now a nightmare landscape of shell craters, fallen trees, and improvised defensive positions. They were advancing through the city's subway tunnels, fighting brutal close-quarters battles in pitch-black passages against German defenders who knew they were going to die but kept fighting anyway, out of fear or fanaticism, or simply because they didn't know what else to do. The Reich Chancellery itself, Hitler's seat of power, the building that symbolized Nazi authority, was being directly targeted by Soviet artillery. Shells crashed down constantly. Chunks of masonry, some of them weighing tons, fell from the upper floors into the courtyard. The grand halls where Hitler had once received foreign diplomats and signed decrees expanding his empire were open to the sky, their roofs blown away, their interiors filled with rubble and dust, and the scattered remains of what had once been symbols of power. Inside the bunker, as the battle came closer, conditions deteriorated from merely unpleasant to genuinely nightmarish. The ventilation system, never adequate for the number of people crammed into this space, was failing completely. The air became thick and hard to breathe, heavy with carbon dioxide, and the smell of unwashed bodies. The generators that provided electricity sputtered and coughed, their fuel supplies running low, causing the lights to flicker ominously. Sometimes they would go out completely for minutes at a time, plunging the bunker into absolute darkness, broken only by flashlights and candles. The water pressure, which had been weak for days, disappeared entirely. No more showers, not that anyone had been, taking them regularly anyway. The toilets didn't flush properly, creating sanitation problems in a confined space that exacerbated the already unbearable smell. Food supplies, which had been rationed carefully, were running desperately low. People were living on thin, watery soup made from whatever vegetables could be found, and stale bread that was more like hardtack. Some of the staff had begun taking the cyanide capsules that the SS had distributed earlier, small glass vials that could be bitten to release poison instantly. It seemed easier, more certain, than waiting for the Soviets to arrive. The psychological atmosphere was one of surreal desperation mixed with bizarre normalcy, like being trapped on a sinking ship where some passengers were screaming and others were calmly rearranging deck chairs. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime mistress and companion, had refused to leave Berlin when Hitler gave her the chance weeks earlier. She had arrived at the bunker in mid-April, flying in from Bavaria against his express wishes, telling him she wanted to be with him at the end. It was a gesture that appeared romantic and self-sacrificing on the surface, the devoted woman choosing to die alongside her beloved rather than live without him. But those who knew Eva, who had watched her over the years, saw something more complex. She had spent her entire adult life in Hitler's shadow, kept secret from the German public, never acknowledged officially, treated as little more than a mistress who was useful for private companionship, but not worthy of public recognition. The Nazi hierarchy had ignored her. She had no power, no status, no real identity beyond being Hitler's girlfriend. Now, in these final days, with everything collapsing and death certain, she finally had his full attention. He needed her. He wanted her presence. And so she stayed, and she tried to maintain some semblance of normal life in the bunker. She threw small parties in her room, serving champagne that had been looted from the Reich Chancellery wine cellars. She played music on a gramophone, light dance tunes that seemed obscene against the backdrop of artillery fire. She laughed and chatted with the secretaries, gossiping about trivial things while the world ended above them. Some saw this as courage, maintaining morale in the face of doom. Others saw it as a kind of madness, a denial so complete that it became its own form of delusion. Hitler himself had become increasingly detached from his surroundings, floating in and out of reality, like someone suffering from a high fever. He spent long periods alone in his private quarters, sitting on his narrow bed, staring at the portrait of Frederick the Great. The Prussian king had faced impossible odds during the 7 Years' War in the 18th century, completely surrounded by enemies, his armies shattered, his kingdom on the brink of total collapse. And then miraculously, impossibly, his enemies had turned on each other. Russia had withdrawn from the war when the Tsarina died, and was replaced by her son, who admired Frederick. France and Austria had exhausted themselves fighting each other, and Prussia had survived. Frederick had been saved by what historians called the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Hitler was waiting for his own miracle. He had convinced himself, with the desperate fervor of a drowning man grasping at straws, that Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12th would split the Allied coalition. He believed that the Americans and British would realize that their true enemy was Soviet communism, not Nazi Germany, and would join with Germany in fighting against Stalin's forces. It was completely delusional, divorced from any understanding of how the Allies actually thought or what they wanted, but he clung to this fantasy because the alternative was too unbearable to accept. The alternative was that he, Adolf Hitler, was personally responsible for Germany's destruction, that his decisions had led directly to this catastrophe, that everything he had built was based on lies and hatred and was now collapsing exactly as it deserved to collapse. On April 29th, news reached the bunker that shattered even Hitler's capacity for delusion and fantasy. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had been Hitler's closest ally and in many ways his model and inspiration, had been captured by Italian partisans near Lake Como as he tried to flee to Switzerland. The partisans had recognized him despite his disguise. They had taken him and his mistress, Clara Petacci, to a small village, and there, without trial or ceremony, they had executed both of them, shooting them and letting their bodies fall in the dirt. But the partisans hadn't stopped there. They had taken the corpses to Milan, to the Piazzale Loreto, a public square. They had hung the bodies upside down from the roof of a gas station, putting them on display like meat in a butcher shop. And crowds had gathered, huge crowds of Italian civilians who had suffered under Mussolini's rule. They spat on the corpses, they beat them with sticks, they threw stones, they mutilated the bodies in ways that were barely describable. Photographs were taken and were already spreading across the world, images that would become iconic symbols of the fall of fascism. When Hitler saw the reports and the photographs, he went absolutely silent. The people around him said he stared at the images for what seemed like an eternity, his face completely blank. No rage this time, no breakdown, just a deep, profound silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, speaking almost to himself, he said words that revealed everything about his final mental state. "I will not be put on display like Mussolini. I will not let them do to me what they did to him." That was the moment when Adolf Hitler truly accepted that death was inevitable and imminent, and that his only remaining choice, his only remaining power, was to control how that death would happen. He couldn't win the war. He couldn't save Germany. He couldn't even save his own life. But he could, he believed, control his death, choreograph it, make it happen on his terms rather than theirs. That evening, April 29th, he made the necessary arrangements. He called for a city official named Walter Wagner, who had some legal authority to perform civil ceremonies. At 1 o'clock in the morning, in the small conference room of the bunker, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were married. It was a brief civil ceremony, perfunctory and cold. Hitler's hand shook so badly that he could barely hold the pen to sign the marriage register. Eva signed her name, began to write Braun out of habit, crossed it out, and wrote Hitler instead. They toasted with champagne, though the champagne was cheap and tasted bitter. Witnesses who attended said Hitler was strangely calm during the ceremony, almost gentle with Eva, polite and formal in a way he hadn't been in years. It was as if some enormous pressure had been released, as if finally accepting death had brought him a kind of terrible peace. After the wedding, Hitler retired to a side room and began dictating his final will and testament. This would be his last message to the world, his final statement of his beliefs, and his justification for everything he had done. And it was exactly what you would expect from someone so utterly incapable of self-reflection or taking responsibility. He blamed everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. He blamed the Jews, claiming that they had orchestrated the entire war specifically to destroy Germany and that he had simply been defending his people. He blamed the generals, saying they had betrayed him through incompetence and cowardice. He blamed the German people themselves, suggesting that they had proven themselves unworthy of his leadership and of the great destiny he had offered them. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the Nazi Party. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, though the Reich that Dönitz would inherit existed only in theory at this point. He gave instructions for the continuation of the fight against what he called international Jewry, as if the war could somehow continue without him. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned his marriage to Eva and his decision to die in Berlin rather than flee. There was no reflection, no acknowledgement of the millions of deaths he had caused, no remorse for the Holocaust or the war or the destruction of Europe. Just blame, resentment, hatred, and a final command for the fight to continue. Even in death, Adolf Hitler could not escape what he had always been. April 30th, 1945, the final day of Adolf Hitler's life. The morning military briefing was brief because there was almost nothing left to brief about. The military situation was beyond hopeless. Soviet forces were literally in the buildings above the bunker, fighting room to room through the Reich Chancellery. It was only a matter of hours, maybe less, before they found the entrance to the bunker and came down the stairs. Hitler listened to the reports quietly, nodded, asked a few perfunctory questions, and then dismissed his generals. There would be no more briefings, no more studying maps, no more moving colored pins around and pretending that armies existed to carry out orders. It was over, and everyone knew it. Hitler had lunch with his two secretaries, Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, and his cook, Constanze Manziarli. He was surprisingly polite, almost courteous, thanking them for their years of service. He gave them each cyanide capsules as parting gifts, small vials wrapped in brass, in case they preferred that method to whatever the Soviets might do to them when they arrived. Then he said goodbye, shook their hands formally, and told them to try to escape to the west if they could. Some of the women wept openly. Others just stood there in shock, numb, unable to fully process what was happening. They had typed his letters, served his meals, listened to his rants for years, and now it was ending like this, with a polite handshake and a cyanide capsule. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva retreated to his private quarters for the last time. His personal valet, Heinz Linge, and his SS aide, Otto Günsche, stood guard outside the door. Others waited nearby in the corridor and in adjacent rooms, though no one was quite sure what they were waiting for or what they were supposed to do. The sound of artillery was constant now, a rhythmic pounding that shook dust and small pieces of concrete from the ceiling. You could hear small arms fire very clearly, which meant Soviet infantry were in the government quarter, probably in the Reich Chancellery building itself, fighting the last desperate defenders room by room, floor by floor. Everyone knew the end was minutes or hours away at most. The air in the bunker felt heavy, oppressive, like the atmosphere before a terrible storm. Minutes passed in silence. Then suddenly, a single gunshot, muffled by the concrete walls and the heavy door, but absolutely unmistakable to anyone who had ever heard a pistol fired. Linge and Günsche looked at each other. They waited a moment, unsure if they should enter immediately or give it more time. Then Linge slowly opened the door. The scene inside was almost anticlimactic in its quietness, its ordinariness. Adolf Hitler was slumped on the small sofa against the wall, his body tilted slightly to the right. A Walther pistol, a small 7.65 millimeter weapon, lay on the floor near his right hand where it had fallen. Blood had run from his right temple where the bullet had entered, flowing down his cheek and jaw, staining his gray-green military jacket. His eyes were open but unseeing, staring at nothing. Eva Braun sat beside him on the sofa, her body positioned as if she had simply fallen asleep, leaning against him. There was no blood on her, no visible wound. She had bitten down on a cyanide capsule, and the smell of bitter almonds, the distinctive scent of cyanide, still hung faintly in the air of the small room. On the table in front of them sat a vase with flowers, now wilting. The portrait of Frederick the Great still hung on the wall, the Prussian king staring down at the scene with painted indifference. It was over. The man who had terrorized Europe for more than a decade, who had started a war that killed tens of millions of people, who had built an entire regime on hatred and violence and dreams of empire, who had promised his followers glory and conquest and a 1,000-year Reich, had ended his own life in a damp concrete room 20 feet beneath a city he had destroyed. But even in death, even in this final moment, Adolf Hitler was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to shape how he would be remembered. His orders had been explicit and detailed, given hours earlier and repeated to make absolutely certain they would be carried out. His body and Eva's were to be taken upstairs immediately. They were to be burned completely, totally destroyed, reduced to ash, so that nothing recognizable remained for the enemy to find. He would not be captured. He would not be put on trial. He would not be photographed as a prisoner. And most importantly, most critically, he would not be put on display like Mussolini, hung upside down for crowds to mock and mutilate. His corpse would not become a trophy or a symbol of defeat. There would be nothing left to find, nothing left to desecrate. That was his final act of control, his last exercise of power. Linge, Günsche, and several SS guards carried out these orders with mechanical efficiency born from years of following commands without question. They wrapped the bodies in blankets. Hitler's body was heavy, dead weight, difficult to maneuver through the narrow corridors and up the spiral staircase. They carried both bodies up to ground level, through the emergency exit that led to the Reich Chancellery Garden, or what had once been a garden. Now it was a cratered wasteland of broken earth, destroyed trees, and rubble from the surrounding buildings. The area was under constant shell fire. Soviet artillery batteries were deliberately targeting the Reich Chancellery, firing at regular intervals. Shells screamed overhead and exploded nearby, sending up geysers of dirt and debris. The guards worked quickly, urgently, knowing that at any moment a direct hit could kill them all. They laid the bodies in a shallow shell crater just outside the bunker exit. Someone, accounts differ on exactly who, poured gasoline over the corpses. Lots of gasoline, can after can of it, soaking the bodies and the blankets until they were saturated. The smell was overpowering, even in the open air filled with smoke and cordite. Someone struck a match and tossed it onto the pile. The flames caught immediately, explosively, a huge whoosh of fire that sent black smoke billowing up into the gray Berlin sky. The heat was intense, forcing the guards to step back. They stood at attention for a moment, 6 or 7 men in SS uniforms, and gave a final Hitler salute, arms extended as the bodies burned. Then they retreated quickly back into the bunker as another shell exploded nearby, showering the area with dirt and shrapnel. They left the bodies to burn unattended, the flames consuming flesh and bone, while Soviet shells continued to fall around the garden. Over the next several hours, they returned periodically to add more gasoline, to ensure the job was being done properly and completely. By the time they were finished, there wasn't much left to find. Some bone fragments, some ash, nothing that could be easily identified by sight. They scraped what remained into another shell hole, covered it with dirt, and left it. It was a pathetic, inglorious end for a man who had once dreamed of monuments and memorials that would last for thousands of years, who had imagined himself as a figure of world historical importance. His body would be found later by Soviet troops, identified through dental records, and then kept secret by Stalin for years, who enjoyed spreading rumors that Hitler had escaped and was hiding somewhere, perhaps to sow confusion or simply because it amused him to do so. But back in the bunker on that afternoon of April 30th, when word spread quickly through the corridors and rooms that Hitler was dead, that the Führer had shot himself, the reaction wasn't grief or shock or disbelief. It was relief. Immediate, overwhelming, palpable relief. The spell was broken. The psychological hold that Hitler had maintained over these people through force of personality and fear, and the cult of obedience that defined the Nazi regime, was suddenly gone. People could think clearly again. They could make rational decisions about their own survival. Within hours, many of the remaining staff and officers began preparing to escape, to flee the bunker before the Soviets found it. Some succeeded, making their way through the subway tunnels and sewers, emerging in different parts of the city, and blending into the chaos of refugees and displaced persons. Others were captured almost immediately, but the important thing was that they were finally free to try, free to act on their own behalf, rather than waiting for orders from a man who was now dead. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, and one of his most fanatically loyal followers, chose a different path. Goebbels had been with Hitler almost from the beginning, one of the earliest members of the Nazi Party, one of the men who had helped build the cult of the Führer through brilliant and evil manipulation of media and mass psychology. He had brought his entire family to the bunker in the final days, his wife Magda and their 6 children, all young, all innocent of any crimes except being born to monsters. When Hitler died, Goebbels could have fled. He could have tried to save himself and his family, but he was a true believer in the most absolute sense. He believed that a world without National Socialism, without Hitler's vision, was not worth living in, and so he made a decision that ranks among the most horrific acts of those final days. On the evening of May 1st, Magda Goebbels went to the room where her children were sleeping. She had drugged them earlier with morphine so they wouldn't wake up, and then systematically, one by one, she crushed cyanide capsules in their mouths. Helga, 12 years old. Hilda, 11. Helmut, 9. Holda, 8. Hedda, 6. Haida, 4. 6 children murdered by their own mother because she believed death was preferable to living in a world where the Nazis had lost. After the children were dead, Joseph and Magda Goebbels went up to the garden where Hitler's body had been burned hours earlier. They had an SS guard shoot them both. Their bodies were also burned, though less thoroughly than Hitler's. It was one final act of fanatical loyalty, as senseless and evil as everything that had come before it. Berlin fell completely on May 2nd, 1945. The remaining German defenders, those who hadn't already been killed or captured, surrendered to Soviet forces. The battle for the city had lasted 16 days and had cost hundreds of thousands of lives, German and Soviet, military and civilian. Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag, the bombed-out shell of Germany's parliament building that had become a symbol of Nazi power. Photographers captured the moment, and the image became one of the most iconic photographs of the entire war. A Soviet soldier standing on top of the ruined building, waving the red flag with the hammer and sickle against a sky filled with smoke. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies at a ceremony in Reims, France. On May 8th, the surrender was formalized in Berlin, and the war in Europe was officially over. The Third Reich, which Adolf Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, which he had claimed was destined to rule the world, had lasted exactly 12 years, 4 months, and 8 days, and in its wake, it left a continent in ruins, tens of millions of people dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, and a legacy of horror that would haunt humanity for generations to come. But here's what makes Hitler's final days so psychologically compelling, and so deeply disturbing when you really examine them. It wasn't just the physical collapse of his empire that defined those last weeks in the bunker. It was the psychological collapse of the man himself, the complete disintegration of his mental framework. Because for all his talk throughout the years about destiny and fate and providence, for all his speeches about the superiority of the German people and the inevitability of their triumph, Hitler's entire worldview was fundamentally, essentially about himself. He could not conceive of Germany surviving his defeat because, in his mind, Germany and Hitler were synonymous, one and the same thing. The nation existed as an extension of his will. The people existed to serve his vision. When the myth of his own invincibility shattered, when he could no longer pretend even to himself that victory was possible, he didn't try to save his country or minimize the damage or protect his people. He tried to destroy everything. In his final political testament, in those last words he dictated to be preserved for history, he blamed the German people for their weakness, for failing him, for not being worthy of his leadership. He ordered a scorched earth policy, the complete destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure, factories, bridges, power plants, everything, so that nothing would be left for the Allies or for any future Germany that might rise from the ashes. His reasoning was simple and chilling. If he couldn't rule Germany, then Germany didn't deserve to exist. Thankfully, mercifully, that final order was largely ignored by the few German officials still in a position to carry it out. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, and one of his few associates who maintained some connection to reality, later claimed that he had actively sabotaged Hitler's demolition orders, working behind the scenes to preserve infrastructure that would be needed for Germany's survival after the war. Historians debate how much credit Speer actually deserves for this, as he spent much of his post-war life trying to rehabilitate his image and distance himself from Nazi crimes. But the important point is that Hitler's final orders were not fully implemented. The destruction that did occur was bad enough, the result of fighting and bombing and the general chaos of collapse. But it could have been far worse if Hitler's nihilistic vision had been fully realized. His final act as Führer wasn't one of noble self-sacrifice or even cold strategic calculation. It was petulant, childish nihilism. He had built his entire identity, his entire sense of self, on power and control. When that power evaporated, when control slipped from his trembling hands, he had nothing left inside. No moral framework to fall back on. No human compassion that might have led him to try to save lives. No ability whatsoever to accept responsibility for his failures. Just rage and emptiness, and a desire to drag everyone down with him into the darkness. And that's the real lesson of the bunker, the thing that makes this story more than just a historical curiosity about the end of a dictator. Hitler didn't lose the war in April 1945. He lost it long before that moment, maybe as early as December 1941, when he declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, turning a European conflict into a truly global war that Germany had no realistic chance of winning. Or maybe in June 1941 when he invaded the Soviet Union, opening a massive Eastern Front that would bleed Germany white. Or September 1939 when he invaded Poland and triggered British and French declarations of war. Or perhaps even earlier, maybe the moment he chose the path of hatred and conquest and racial supremacy over any other possibility for Germany's future. But he couldn't see it. He had surrounded himself completely with yes men, with people who told him only what he wanted to hear. He had created a system where dissent was not just discouraged, but brutally crushed, where speaking truth to power was literally a death sentence. He had built a cult of personality so powerful, so all-encompassing, that even he himself believed it, believed in his own mythology, his own propaganda. By the time physical reality finally caught up with his delusions, by the time the gap between what he believed and what was actually true became impossible to ignore, it was far too late to change course. All he could do was hide underground, issue impossible orders to armies that existed only on paper, and wait for the end that he had made inevitable. The people who were with Hitler in those final days, the secretaries and guards and officers who survived to tell their stories, described a strange, almost dreamlike atmosphere in the bunker. There was this profound disconnect between what was happening above ground, the death and destruction, the complete collapse of everything they had known, and the routine of life in the bunker, the regular meals, the twice-daily briefings, the small talk, and gossip, and mundane conversations. It was as if they were all actors in a play that had gone on too long, going through their lines and hitting their marks, because no one had told them they could stop, because no one knew what else to do. Some people drank heavily, consuming whatever alcohol could be found in the Reich chancellery cellars. Others flirted and carried on affairs, seeking some kind of human connection or distraction in the face of approaching doom. A few tried desperately to keep working, filing reports and sending messages that no one would ever read, maintaining the bureaucratic machinery of a state that had already ceased to exist. And in the center of it all was Hitler himself, shuffling through the concrete corridors, his left hand trembling uncontrollably, his eyes vacant, a man who had once held the fate of millions in his hands, now reduced to staring at maps and waiting for a miracle that would never come. There's one particular moment from those final days that really captures the psychology of what was happening in the bunker. It was April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday. In normal times, in the earlier years of the Nazi regime, this would have been a massive national celebration, practically a holiday. There would have been parades through every major city, elaborate ceremonies, speeches broadcast on every radio station, thousands of people gathering in public squares to celebrate their Führer, elaborate gifts presented by party officials competing to show their loyalty. But in April 1945, with Berlin surrounded and Germany collapsing, there was only a brief, sad gathering in the bunker conference room. His remaining inner circle came to offer their congratulations. Goebbels was there, Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary. Albert Speer had flown in from his travels around Germany, the senior generals, a few party officials. There was a cake, though no one had much appetite for it. There were toasts with champagne, though the champagne tasted sour and wrong in that concrete room with artillery shaking the ceiling. And there was the question that everyone wanted to ask, but no one dared to speak directly. Would Hitler leave Berlin? Would he fly south to Bavaria, to Berchtesgaden, to the Alpine fortress, where theoretically the remaining German forces could make some kind of last stand and perhaps negotiate better surrender terms? It was his last realistic chance to escape, to survive, to avoid capture or death, his generals pleaded. With him in the most respectful terms they could manage. They explained that he could continue to lead Germany from the south, that losing Berlin didn't mean losing the war, even though everyone knew it did. Even Goebbels, who was usually the most fanatically loyal and would eventually choose to die alongside Hitler, suggested gently that it might be wise to consider relocating to ensure the survival of the leadership, but Hitler refused absolutely. He had made up his mind. He would stay in Berlin. He would not leave. He would die here in the capital. And when they pressed him, when they tried to understand his reasoning, he said something that was recorded by multiple witnesses and that reveals everything about his psychology at that moment. The exact words vary slightly in different accounts, but the meaning is consistent. He said something to the effect of, "If I leave Berlin, I lose my authority. I lose the myth. Better to die here as Führer than live somewhere else as nothing." That statement, if the accounts are accurate, reveals the absolute core of Hitler's psychology and explains everything about his final days. He wasn't staying in Berlin out of courage or bravery. He wasn't staying out of loyalty to the German people or a sense of duty to fight to the last. He was staying because leaving would mean admitting defeat, admitting that he was not the superhuman, destined figure he had portrayed himself as for over a decade. His myth, his carefully constructed image as the infallible Führer, mattered more to him than his own life. And so he chose death, not as a sacrifice, but as a final performance, as one last attempt to control the narrative. He would stage his own end. He would choreograph his death. He would deny his enemies the satisfaction of capturing him or putting him on trial. And he hoped, genuinely believed, that by dying in Berlin he would become a martyr, a legend, a symbol that future generations of Nazis could rally around. Of course, it didn't work out that way at all. Instead of becoming a martyred hero, he became the ultimate symbol of catastrophic failure, a cautionary tale taught to every generation since about the dangers of unchecked power, delusional ideology, and the worship of authoritarian strongmen. In the days and weeks following Hitler's death, as the news spread across Germany and then around the world, many people simply couldn't believe it. For millions of Germans, Hitler had been more than just a political leader. He had been a quasi-religious figure, a messianic savior who had promised to restore Germany's greatness after the humiliation of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. He had given them purpose and pride, or at least the illusion of it. When that illusion came crashing down, when the reality of total defeat and utter destruction became undeniable, it was psychologically easier for many people to believe in fantasy than to confront the terrible truth. The truth that they had followed a madman, the truth that they had been complicit, whether actively or passively, in unimaginable crimes. The truth that everything they had believed in and fought for and sacrificed for had been built on lies, and so rumors spread like wildfire that Hitler had escaped, that the body in the bunker was a double, that the Führer was still alive somewhere, hiding in South America or Antarctica or a secret submarine base, waiting for the right moment to return and lead Germany to victory. These conspiracy theories persisted for years, even decades, fueled partly by Soviet secrecy about the physical remains and partly by a desperate psychological need among some Germans to avoid facing reality. The bunker became a kind of metaphor for that denial, that willful blindness. It was a place where reality could be kept at bay just a little longer, where the illusion could survive, even as the world outside burned to ash, where Hitler could still believe he was in control even as control had long since slipped away, where his followers could still pretend they were serving a great cause, even as that cause devoured itself and everyone around it. The concrete walls were physical barriers, yes, but they were also psychological barriers, keeping out the truth as much as they kept out the Soviet army. What happened to the other people in the bunker, the ones who didn't choose death? Some, like Goebbels and his family, embraced fanaticism to the very end. Others, like Martin Bormann, tried to escape and were killed in the chaos, shot by Soviet soldiers or caught in artillery fire as they fled through the streets. A few actually succeeded in getting away, disappearing into the mass of refugees and displaced persons that flooded across Germany in the war's final days. They were later captured by Allied forces, interrogated extensively, and in many cases tried for war crimes at Nuremberg or subsequent trials. Their testimonies, given under oath and cross-examination, provided much of what we know about Hitler's final days and the atmosphere in the bunker. Most of them tried desperately to distance themselves from the regime's worst crimes, claiming they were just following orders, that they hadn't known the full extent of the Holocaust, that they were merely doing their jobs. These excuses rang hollow at the Nuremberg trials, where the true scope of Nazi atrocities was revealed to a horrified world through mountains of documentary evidence and the testimony of survivors. The bunker itself remained as a physical structure for some years after the war, a concrete scar hidden beneath the ruins of Berlin. For a while, the Soviets left it largely untouched, using parts of it for storage or sealing off other sections. The area became part of East Berlin during the Cold War, a restricted zone that ordinary people couldn't access. There was never any serious consideration of preserving it as a museum or historical site. The decision was made, consciously and deliberately, that this place should not become a shrine or a pilgrimage destination for neo-Nazis and Hitler sympathizers. Eventually, most of the bunker complex was demolished or filled in with concrete and rubble. Today, there's almost nothing left to see, just a parking lot and an information panel that marks approximately where the bunker entrance used to be. It's a deliberate erasure, a collective decision by German society that some places are better forgotten, or at least not honored or memorialized. The memory of what happened there remains, preserved in documents and testimonies and historical records, but the physical place itself has been allowed to disappear. But while the bunker is gone, the lessons of what happened there remain vitally important, because the bunker represents more than just the endpoint of one particular dictator's reign. It represents the inevitable conclusion of a certain kind of destructive ideology, the final destination of a worldview built entirely on hate and lies, and the worship of power for its own sake. Hitler's final days weren't tragic in the classical literary sense of that word. There was no noble fall of a great man brought low by a single fatal flaw. There was no moment of recognition or redemption where he finally understood what he had done and felt remorse. There was just a broken man surrounded by the wreckage of his own creation, clinging desperately to delusions until the very end, and then choosing oblivion over accountability because facing the truth of what he had done was psychologically impossible for him. The world that emerged from the ruins of World War II was absolutely determined not to forget what had happened, not to let the memory of these horrors fade. The Holocaust was documented in excruciating detail. The Nazis' crimes were cataloged and studied and memorialized. The Nuremberg trials established new principles of international law, creating for the first time the legal concept of crimes against humanity and holding political and military leaders personally accountable for atrocities committed under their command. The United Nations was founded specifically to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again, to create international mechanisms for resolving disputes without resorting to total war. And in Germany itself, eventually, after initial resistance and denial, a process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung began, a German word that roughly translates as coming to terms with the past, an ongoing national effort to confront what happened honestly and build a fundamentally different kind of society. Yet despite all of this, despite the documentation and the memorials, and the education and the vow of never again, the lessons of the bunker remain tragically relevant today. Because while Hitler's specific ideology and his particular regime were defeated militarily in 1945, the psychological and social mechanisms that enabled his rise have not disappeared from human society. They still exist in different forms, in different contexts, in different countries. The appeal of strongman leadership, the promise that one powerful individual can solve all problems if only given enough authority, the power of propaganda and manipulation to shape people's perception of reality, to make them believe demonstrable lies if those lies confirm what they want to believe, the danger of dehumanizing other groups, of building political movements on the premise that certain people are less than human and therefore don't deserve rights or compassion, the seduction of believing that your group, your nation, your race is inherently superior and destined to dominate others, the gradual normalization of violence and cruelty when those things are directed at the dehumanized other, These forces still exist in our world. They appear in different disguises. They use different rhetoric, but the underlying psychology, the fundamental human vulnerabilities that Hitler exploited so effectively, those haven't changed. And that's ultimately why we continue to study and tell the story of Hitler's final days, why the bunker remains a powerful symbol decades after it was demolished, not to glorify or sensationalize or satisfy morbid curiosity, but to remember, to understand at a deep level how a modern, educated, culturally sophisticated nation could follow a man like Hitler into the abyss, to recognize the warning signs before they become obvious, to resist the temptation of easy answers and convenient scapegoats when societies face real problems, to understand that evil, when stripped of all its propaganda and pageantry and carefully constructed mythology, when it finally faces the consequences of its own actions, is not impressive or fearsome or powerful. It's small and desperate and pathetic, and ultimately self-destroying. The Third Reich ended not with Wagnerian grandeur or epic last stands, or any of the dramatic imagery that Hitler had imagined for himself. It ended with a single muffled gunshot in a cramped underground room that smelled of diesel fuel and fear. It ended with the smell of cyanide and bitter almonds. It ended with bodies burning in a cratered garden while shells fell around them. The empire that had terrorized a continent, that had sent millions to death camps and millions more to their deaths in war, was reduced in its final hours to a handful of people huddled in a concrete tomb, too afraid or too fanatical to leave, waiting for the inevitable end. And the man who had promised to reshape the world in his image, who had declared that his Reich would last 1,000 years, died exactly as he had lived, surrounded by lies, completely unable to face the truth of what he had done, choosing annihilation over introspection or accountability. On May 8th, 1945, when victory in Europe was officially declared, people across the Allied nations poured into the streets to celebrate. They danced and sang and embraced strangers and wept with relief and joy. The nightmare was finally over. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years had ended at last. But in Berlin, among the smoking ruins and the crater-pocked streets and the bodies that still littered the sidewalks, the mood was very different. There was relief, yes. The fighting had stopped. The shells were no longer falling. But there was also shock and grief and trauma and an overwhelming sense of loss. This had been their capital, their city, and it had been utterly destroyed. Not just by Allied bombs or Soviet artillery, though those had certainly contributed, but by their own leader, who had valued his pride and his myth more than he valued their lives or their future. And that's the final bitter irony of Hitler's last days, the thing that makes this story so darkly instructive. He believed until his final breath that he was Germany's savior, that history would vindicate him, that his name and his legacy would endure for centuries as the greatest leader his people had ever known. Instead, he became the man who destroyed Germany more thoroughly than any foreign enemy could have. The cities he left in ruins, the millions of lives he threw away for nothing, the generation of young men he sent to die in a war that could never be won, the moral stain he left on his nation's soul that persists to this day. All of it was his doing, the direct result of his choices and his ideology, and his complete inability to see other human beings as deserving of compassion or consideration. The bunker was meant to be his fortress, his command center, the place from which he would orchestrate final victory. Instead, it became his tomb, the place where his delusions finally, inevitably, fatally collided with reality, and reality won as it always does in the end. The story of Hitler's final days isn't really about military strategy or political maneuvering, or even about war in the conventional sense. At its core, it's a story about the human capacity for self-deception taken to its absolute extreme. It's about what happens when power is concentrated in the hands of someone who cannot accept limits, who cannot admit mistakes, who cannot see other people as fully human. It's about the danger of surrounding yourself with yes men who tell you only what you want to hear. It's about the inevitable endpoint of ideologies built on hatred and racial supremacy and the worship of strength. And most importantly, it's about that terrible moment when the lies can no longer hold, when reality comes crashing in with overwhelming force, and all that remains is a choice between facing what you've done or escaping into death. Hitler chose escape, and in that final choice, he revealed the ultimate emptiness at the heart of his entire project, his entire life. For all the grand speeches about destiny and greatness, for all the rallies and uniforms and symbols of power, for all the talk of thousand-year empires and racial superiority and Germany's rightful place as ruler of Europe, when it all came down to that final moment in that small concrete room, there was nothing there, no courage, no honor, no willingness to face consequences, just a frightened old man with a trembling hand, having learned nothing, having felt nothing for anyone but himself, having destroyed everything and everyone around him in service of an ego too fragile to bear the weight of failure. He pulled the trigger and ended his own life, and with it ended the nightmare of Nazi Germany. The world moved on. Berlin was slowly, painfully rebuilt. Germany was divided and occupied, and eventually reunited. The survivors told their stories, so the world would remember. The victims were mourned and memorialized. The crimes were documented in exhaustive detail. And the bunker crumbled into dust and was eventually erased because some places are better forgotten. Some stories need to be told, but not honored. And some endings serve best as warnings, as reminders of what happens when humanity is abandoned in favor of power, when compassion is replaced by hate, when truth is destroyed by propaganda, and when millions of people place their faith in one man who believed himself to be a god, but died as all tyrants ultimately do, alone, afraid, defeated, and utterly, absolutely wrong about everything.